A quiet Texas street turned into a live courtroom when two imposters in tactical vests tried to detain a homeowner. But the man they picked wasn't just any resident. He was the FBI agent they never should have messed with. On a Saturday morning in Plano, Texas, the kind of morning where families mow their lawns and kids ride bikes along cul-de-sacs, Reginald Carter walked out of his 2-story brick home with nothing on his mind but taking the trash to the curb. He didn't even make it 10 steps before he noticed 3 figures waiting at the edge of his driveway. 2 men in black tactical-style vests, patches that read "Community Enforcement" stitched across their chests. And standing between them was Linda Whitfield, the president of the Homeowners Association. She wasn't smiling. Neither were they. Reginald slowed, gripping the trash bag in one hand, and studied the trio. At first glance, they might have looked official to a nervous neighbor, but something about them didn't add up. Their vests were mismatched, one too big, the other with Velcro straps hanging loose. Their boots were scuffed like they'd been bought second-hand. And the way they stood, too stiff, too rehearsed, set off alarms in his head. "Mr. Carter," Linda began, her voice sharp, as if she'd practiced this moment. "We need to talk." Reginald set the trash bag down, calmly resting his hands on his hips. "About what?" One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, pale, with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses that made it impossible to read his eyes. "Community enforcement," he said flatly. "You're in violation of neighborhood regulations. We're here to detain you until police arrive." The words dropped like a rock. "Detain me?" Reginald repeated, his tone low, almost amused. Linda crossed her arms tightly. "You've ignored repeated notices, and this has gone too far. We can't have someone undermining our community rules. These men are here to make sure you comply." Reginald raised an eyebrow, looking from Linda to the 2 so-called officers. "And what exactly are the charges?" The second man, shorter, broad-shouldered with a messy beard, pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest. "Property violations, non-compliance with HOA orders, unauthorized modifications to your driveway, loud gatherings, the list goes on." Reginald almost laughed. "So you think that gives you the right to walk onto my property and, what did you call it, detain me?" The taller man's jaw tightened. "That's right. You can come peacefully, or we'll make it harder on you." For a moment the air was still. The neighborhood seemed to pause, like the world itself was listening. From a few houses down, Reginald caught a curtain shift. Someone was watching. Then another. He knew the pattern. Eyes behind blinds, phones in hand. Reginald took a slow step forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Let me explain something to you. There is no such thing as community enforcement. You're not law enforcement. You don't have any authority here, and you're trespassing." Linda's cheeks flushed. "Don't talk to me about authority, Reginald. You think you're above the rules because of who you are. We've had complaints, real complaints, and I'm not going to sit by and let this neighborhood fall apart." The bearded man shifted uncomfortably, but the taller one stayed rigid, his hand hovering just above his belt as if he wanted Reginald to believe he was armed. Reginald tilted his head, his gaze sharp. He'd seen men like this before, wannabes who thought a vest and a stern face made them untouchable. But he also knew what they didn't, that he wasn't just a homeowner. He was a trained federal agent who had spent years dismantling criminal networks and interrogating men who were a lot more dangerous than these 2 imposters. But instead of revealing anything, he simply smiled. "You've picked the wrong driveway today." Linda stepped closer, her voice rising. "Don't test me, Reginald. These men can hold you until police arrive, and when they do, you'll be the one answering questions." That was when Reginald finally dropped the trash bag to the ground. The bag split slightly, a soda can clattering across the concrete, the metallic sound echoing down the block. It wasn't the sound of surrender. It was the sound of a man planting his feet, preparing for a confrontation that wasn't going to end the way Linda thought. Neighbors pressed closer to their windows. A teenage boy across the street raised his phone, hitting record. The moment was bigger than a homeowner and an HOA president. It was about to become a neighborhood spectacle. But as tense as things already looked, the real test of control was still ahead. The silence between them didn't last long. The taller man took a bold step forward, boots scraping against the concrete as if he wanted to stake his claim on Reginald's driveway. His mirrored shades reflected back the calm expression on Reginald's face, but inside, the impostor was itching to prove himself. "Sir, don't make this difficult," the man said, his voice rigid. "You're being non-compliant. That means we have the right to escalate." Reginald's lips curved into something close to a smirk. "Escalate? You're standing on my property with no badge, no legal authority, and no clue how deep in trouble you already are. You've got 30 seconds to back off before you regret this stunt." Linda snapped her head toward him, her voice dripping with irritation. "You think threats are going to make this better? You've ignored letters, warnings, and fines. The HOA exists to keep this neighborhood safe and respectable. People like you—" She caught herself mid-sentence, her mouth tightening, as if she'd almost said too much. Reginald caught it instantly, his eyes narrowing. "People like me, huh? Careful how you finish that thought, Linda," the bearded man interjected, trying to reassert control. "Look, this doesn't need to get ugly. Just come with us. We'll wait for the officers, clear this up, and maybe they'll go easy on you." "Officers?" Reginald asked flatly. "You mean the actual police? Or the fake badges you two probably ordered online?" The taller man stiffened, but his partner glanced at Linda with unease. She pushed forward, determined to keep the illusion intact. "These men are authorized by the HOA board to ensure compliance. We don't have to answer to you." Reginald chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Linda, listen to yourself. You brought 2 grown men in bargain bin tactical gear to my driveway. You really think that's how the law works?" By now the audience around them was growing. Curtains moved in nearly every house on the street, and more phones appeared in windows. Someone had even stepped onto their porch, filming openly. Reginald's voice dropped low, meant for the imposters but audible enough for the neighbors watching. "You want to know what real authority looks like? It's not 2 men playing soldier. It's training. It's law. It's accountability. And I promise you the real cops will be very interested in this little performance." The bearded man's throat bobbed, his confidence slipping, but the tall one doubled down, taking another step closer until he was inches from Reginald. "I'm not playing. You're in violation, and if you resist, we'll restrain you. Don't test me." Reginald didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "Son, I've dealt with cartel enforcers who are less reckless than you. Do yourself a favor and move back before this turns into something you can't walk away from." For the first time, doubt flickered across the man's face. His bravado was cracking under the weight of Reginald's composure. Linda, refusing to lose ground, barked out, "Why should the rest of us live by the rules while you do whatever you want? We have a system, Reginald. We have order. And if you won't respect it, then maybe you don't belong here at all." Reginald's gaze fixed on her. Respect isn't forced with fake cops and threats. It's earned. And right now, what you're doing isn't about rules. It's about control. The words hit harder than she expected. For a brief second, Linda's confidence faltered, but she quickly masked it, folding her arms even tighter across her chest. The bearded man shifted his weight, his nerves finally breaking through. "Maybe we should wait in the street," he muttered to his partner. But the taller one shot him a glare. "No, we're not leaving." Reginald let out a slow exhale, studying them carefully. He knew their type. He'd interrogated men who lived on intimidation, who mistook fear for respect. And he also knew exactly how to dismantle them without raising a fist. "Tell me something," Reginald said evenly, turning his attention back to Linda. "When you called these 2 clowns, did you think this through? Because the second the real police roll up, and trust me, they're on their way, they're not going to ask me the hard questions. They're going to ask you why you thought you had the authority to stage an arrest." Linda blinked, the color draining slightly from her cheeks. From across the street, someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" The voice carried, loud enough to ripple down the block. Suddenly, this wasn't just an HOA confrontation, it was turning into a neighborhood standoff. Reginald kept his eyes locked on the men in front of him. "This is your last chance. Walk away now, before the whole block watches you hauled off in handcuffs." The bearded man's face twitched, his resolve slipping. But the tall one clenched his fists, unwilling to let go of the illusion of power. But Reginald knew something the others didn't. This confrontation was only going to get louder, and the neighborhood was about to become the stage for something far bigger. By now, the street was alive with attention. What started as a tense exchange in Reginald's driveway had turned into a live spectacle. Curtains weren't just shifting anymore, windows were opening. Doors cracked ajar. People were leaning over their porches, phones held up, eager to capture every second of what felt like a scene straight from a television show. A retired couple, the Hendersons, stood shoulder to shoulder on their porch across the street. Mr. Henderson shook his head, muttering loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Never seen anything like this. What's she thinking? Bringing fake police into this neighborhood?" His wife whispered back, "I told you Linda would go too far one day." Reginald caught their words in fragments, but he kept his focus on the two impostors. His mind was sharp, cataloguing every detail, their sloppy gear, the way the taller man kept glancing down the street, as if expecting backup that wasn't coming, the restless twitch of the bearded man's hands. They weren't professionals. They were actors in a play that was starting to crumble. From the sidewalk, a teenager named Marcus Johnson. Reginald had seen him shooting hoops before, raised his phone higher and called out, "Yo, Mr. Carter, I got you on live. Thousands are watching." The taller imposter snapped his head toward him. "Put that down," he barked, taking a threatening step in the boy's direction. That was the wrong move. Reginald shifted instantly, cutting his body between the man and the teen. His voice sharpened, cold and steady. "You even think about touching that kid, and this ends right here." The imposter froze, realizing for the first time that Reginald wasn't intimidated, not even close. Linda, flustered, tried to regain her footing. "This is a neighborhood matter. None of you should be interfering." Her words carried, but they only fueled the crowd. A woman with a baby on her hip yelled from a porch, "Neighborhood matter? Looks like harassment to me." More voices chimed in. "This is wrong. Where'd you even find these guys? You can't arrest your neighbor for cutting his grass too short." The longer Linda and her enforcers stood there, the less control they seemed to have. What was meant to scare Reginald had turned into a scene where they were the ones on trial, judged by the eyes of every neighbor around. Reginald let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. "Linda, do you hear them? This isn't order. This is chaos. And you created it." Her jaw clenched, but her voice trembled slightly. "You're twisting this, Reginald. You've always been a problem. Always bending the rules, ignoring the standards we worked so hard to build." He tilted his head, studying her. "No, Linda. The real problem is that you confuse control with leadership. They're not the same." That line carried through the block like a verdict. Neighbors shifted, whispering, nodding to one another. Phones kept recording, lenses catching every flicker of tension. The bearded imposter wiped sweat from his brow. He was unraveling. "Look, man," he muttered under his breath. "Maybe we should just go. This isn't worth it." But his partner hissed, "No, we finish this." The taller man squared his shoulders, trying to look larger than he was. "Last warning. You either come with us peacefully, or we'll use force." Reginald almost laughed at the absurdity. "You really want to do this? In front of every witness on this street? With half a dozen cameras pointed at you? Go ahead. Show the world who you really are." The taller man faltered. His eyes darted nervously at the glowing phone screens, at the murmurs rising in the background. He could feel the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides. Linda stepped forward again, desperation edging her voice. "Don't listen to him. He's manipulating you all. He thinks because of his job—" Reginald cut her off sharply. "Careful, Linda." His tone wasn't raised, but it carried more force than her shouting ever could. "You don't want to finish that sentence." The crowd hushed for a beat, as if everyone understood the implication. Reginald turned his attention back to the imposters, lowering his voice just enough that they had to lean in. "Listen to me carefully. You've got two options right now. You leave quietly and pray the police don't charge you with impersonation, or you keep pretending you have power, and this street watches you get dismantled in real time." The bearded man swallowed hard, eyes flicking to Linda. She gave a tiny shake of her head, clinging to the illusion that she still had control. but control was slipping through her fingers like water. Across the street, Marcus shouted, "They're done, Mr. Carter. We all see it." His words fueled the crowd further, voices rising in agreement. Reginald stayed perfectly still, letting the neighborhood itself become his ally. He didn't need to flex or threaten. The truth was already exposing them, one camera angle at a time. But as the pressure mounted and the block turned into a stage, the imposters made a choice that would push the standoff into dangerous territory. The air was thick with tension, charged by the collective judgment of the neighborhood. Reginald stood steady in his driveway, a pillar of calm, while the two men in vests fidgeted under the weight of 100 unseen eyes. For a brief second, it seemed they might fold. The bearded man's posture screamed retreat, his feet shifting toward the street. But the taller one, the one with the shaved head and mirrored shades, wasn't ready to back down. He suddenly reached into his vest and pulled out a pair of metal handcuffs. They clanked together loudly, the sound slicing through the chatter of the watching neighbors. The crowd gasped, as if they'd all felt the cold bite of those cuffs themselves. "You're under neighborhood arrest," he said, his voice cracking just slightly, betraying the bravado he was trying to maintain. "Don't make me put these on you the hard way." Reginald's eyes locked on the cuffs, then flicked back to the man's face. He spoke slowly, every word precise. "If you take one more step toward me with those cuffs, you're committing a felony. Impersonating an officer. Attempted unlawful restraint. That's prison time, not community service." The man's grip tightened, but his confidence wavered. The bearded partner whispered harshly, "Eddie, this is crazy. We can't actually cuff him. We'll get locked up ourselves." "Shut up," Eddie snapped, his voice carrying across the driveway. Linda tried to salvage the moment. She raised her chin and projected her voice for the neighbors. "Don't let him scare you. This is a law-abiding community, and we have every right to enforce standards. He's just trying to bully his way out." But her words landed flat. The neighbors weren't convinced anymore. Murmurs of disapproval rippled across the street. Someone shouted, "You don't have the right, Linda." Another added, "This isn't enforcement, it's harassment." Reginald leaned slightly closer to Eddie, his tone quiet but sharp as glass. "I've seen real cuffs. I've used real cuffs. And I know when a man is bluffing. Drop them now, before this turns into something you'll never walk away from." Eddie's jaw worked furiously, his pride at war with the reality sinking in around him. The bearded man tugged at his sleeve, voice trembling. "Come on, man. Cameras are rolling. We'll get fried for this." But Eddie shoved him back. "I said I've got this." He stepped forward, thrusting the cuffs out like a weapon. The crowd audibly recoiled, and someone screamed, "Call the cops!" Dozens of phones tilted, capturing every angle of the standoff. Reginald didn't move backward. He didn't flinch. Instead, he squared his shoulders and said in a low, steady voice, "You're one heartbeat away from destroying your life. Think hard before you take that step." For the first time, Eddie hesitated. Sweat beaded along his forehead, glistening in the Texas sun. His hand shook just slightly, enough for everyone to notice. The authority he had tried to project was cracking like glass under pressure. Linda, desperate to regain momentum, shouted, "Do it! Don't let him intimidate you! Put him in cuffs! Show the neighborhood who's in charge!" Her words backfired. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A middle-aged man from 3 houses down yelled back, "Linda, you've lost your mind! You're not the police!" Others chimed in, their voices turning the tide firmly against her. Reginald seized the moment. His voice rose just enough to carry, calm but commanding. "Everyone here sees what's happening. This isn't about rules or violations. This is about power. Fake power. And these men are being pushed by someone who doesn't know the law, doesn't respect the law, and thinks intimidation is leadership." The bearded man dropped his gaze to the ground, shame washing over him. He muttered, "I didn't sign up for this." Eddie glared at him, then at Linda, torn between pride and fear. But before he could decide, Reginald stepped slightly closer, closing the space between them. His eyes were locked onto Eddie's, his voice dropping to that chilling register only professionals carried. "You lay one finger on me, and I promise you, the real police won't even have to ask me who you are. They'll already know, because I'll walk them through every single mistake you've made in the last 10 minutes. You think you're intimidating me? Son, I dismantle men like you for a living. The words landed like a hammer. Eddie froze, his arm locked in place, the cuffs dangling uselessly. The crowd erupted, not with cheers but with a low rumble of approval, voices overlapping. He's right! Leave him alone! You're done! The street itself was choosing sides, and it wasn't with Linda or her imposter enforcers. Reginald finally straightened, his body language relaxed but unyielding. Here's the truth. This is the end of your game. You don't have authority. You don't have power. And the longer you stand here pretending you do, the deeper the hole you're digging. Eddie's shoulders sagged, his grip loosening on the cuffs. The bearded man backed up another step, visibly unraveling. Linda, however, looked like she might explode, her face flushed red, her voice breaking into a shriek. You don't belong here! You never have! That's why you're fighting so hard! The words hung in the air, ugly and raw. The neighbors' murmurs sharpened into outrage. Someone yelled, That's enough, Linda! Another voice, louder this time, You're exposing yourself! Reginald kept his composure, but the sting of her words wasn't lost on him. He looked at her for a long moment, disappointment clear in his eyes. Then he turned back to Eddie and his partner. Take my advice, walk away now. Because the next chapter in this story doesn't end with you walking home, it ends with flashing lights, handcuffs, and charges you won't be able to explain away. But Linda wasn't ready to quit, and her desperation was about to push the imposters into making their most reckless move yet. The standoff had reached a boiling point. Eddie still clutched the handcuffs like a lifeline, his arm hovering mid-air as if he couldn't decide whether to swing or drop them. The bearded man, whose name Reginald overheard in a muttered exchange as Sean, looked ready to bolt. And Linda stood at the center of it all, red-faced and trembling with rage, barking orders that no one seemed willing to follow anymore. Reginald took a breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then he spoke in a voice that was neither loud nor threatening, but carried the weight of authority. Eddie, Sean, let me ask you something simple. Do you even know what happens to a man who impersonates a federal officer? Forget state charges. Forget HOA bylaws. I'm talking about federal law. Do you know the minimum sentence? Eddie blinked behind his mirrored shades, his lips parting like he wanted to answer but couldn't. Reginald didn't wait. 3 years, that's minimum. And that's if you're lucky. If you escalate, if you touch me, we're talking more. Assault, false imprisonment, conspiracy. Do the math. Sean's eyes widened, the fight draining out of him with every word. Linda, he's not joking, he whispered harshly, but everyone nearby still heard it. Linda snapped back. Don't listen to him. He's bluffing. He wants you scared so you back down. Reginald shifted his gaze to her, calm but cutting. You've already lost, Linda. The crowd knows it. Your neighbors know it. And deep down, you know it too. The crowd murmured in agreement. A woman holding her toddler muttered, He's right. This is insane. Eddie's hand finally dropped, the cuffs hanging at his side like dead weight. But Reginald wasn't finished. He stepped forward, closing the distance, and his tone changed. Calm, conversational, but laced with that sharp precision of a man who had stared down cartel lieutenants without breaking a sweat. You know what separates real authority from fake authority? Reginald asked, his eyes moving from Eddie to Sean to Linda. It's accountability. Real officers answer to the law. Fake ones answer to their pride. And pride? Pride will get you killed or locked up. The line hit Eddie like a strike. He shifted uncomfortably, sweat dripping down his temple. Reginald continued, his voice carrying for the neighbors who were still filming. This community deserves better than fear tactics. They deserve honesty. They deserve leaders who solve problems with respect, not intimidation. Linda let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Respect? Don't lecture me about respect. Do you know how many hours I've poured into this neighborhood? Do you know how many complaints I've had to field? People want order, Reginald. They want someone to stand up and keep things proper. Order doesn't come from force, Reginald replied evenly. It comes from trust. And trust is gone the second you drag in imposters with fake vests and threaten your neighbors. Eddie swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe he's right, Linda. Maybe we should just go. No, Linda snapped, spinning toward him. If we walk away now, we lose everything. Everyone here sees this. They'll think I can't handle my job. Do you want that? Sean finally spoke louder, his patience gone. You think this is about your reputation? I'm not going to jail for you, Linda. I didn't sign up for this mess. He ripped the Velcro patch off his vest and tossed it onto the pavement. The cheap fabric fluttered against the driveway like a confession. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Phones zoomed in. The illusion was breaking apart piece by piece. Reginald's gaze returned to Eddie. That's one down. What about you? Eddie's hands trembled, the cuffs rattling against his thigh. For the first time, his bravado cracked enough for Reginald to see the scared man behind the mirrored shades. Think carefully, Reginald pressed, his voice low, almost intimate now. Linda won't be there when the police start asking questions. She won't sit beside you in the courtroom. She won't do your time. She'll save herself. And you'll be the one wearing real cuffs. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Eddie finally let the handcuffs slip from his hand. They clattered against the pavement, the sound ringing louder than Linda's protests. No! Linda shouted, stomping her foot like a child denied candy. Pick them up! Don't let him win! But Eddie didn't move. He backed away a single step, his chest heaving with the weight of regret. Reginald took that moment to drive the final nail in. He straightened, looking directly at Linda. Leadership isn't about winning, Linda. It's about responsibility. And you've failed yours. The neighbors erupted, not with applause, but with a rising tide of voices. He's right. She's gone too far. We don't want this in our neighborhood anymore. Linda looked around, her face pale now, realizing the power she thought she had was slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp. Reginald bent down, picked up the cuffs Eddie had dropped, and held them up for the crowd to see. This is what happens when you confuse control with justice. When you mistake fear for respect. But this isn't justice, it's fraud. The cuffs gleamed in the sun as if to punctuate his words. But before the neighborhood could fully absorb what had just happened, Eddie made a reckless choice that threatened to turn words into violence. The tension should have broken when the cuffs hit the ground, but Eddie wasn't finished. His pride wouldn't let him walk away. With sweat dripping down his temple and his chest rising sharply, he lunged forward, shoving past Sean and closing the gap between himself and Reginald. The crowd gasped in unison. Phones tilted, capturing every angle. Someone shouted, "Don't touch him!" But Eddie either didn't hear or didn't care. He reached for Reginald's wrist, intent on forcing the cuffs back into play. That was his final mistake. In one fluid motion, Reginald's training kicked in. He sidestepped, seized Eddie's arm, and twisted it behind his back with surgical precision. The cuffs Eddie had dropped moments earlier were now in Reginald's hands, snapping shut around Eddie's own wrists before the man could even process what had happened. Eddie cried out, more from shock than pain, and stumbled to his knees. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds, and the crowd roared with disbelief. Someone yelled, "Did you see that?" Another voice echoed, "He didn't even fight back! He just moved!" Reginald didn't gloat. He simply held Eddie in place with minimal force, his voice calm, professional, as though he were conducting business. "You're done. Don't resist. It'll only make it worse." Linda's face twisted in horror. "What are you doing? You can't arrest him." Reginald's eyes snapped to her, sharp and cold. "You're right. I can't. But I can detain him for impersonating an officer until real law enforcement arrives. And considering he just attempted to assault me on my own property, the charges keep stacking." The neighbors erupted again. Some clapped. Others shouted in outrage at Linda. "You set this up. You pushed them too far. This is on you, Linda." Sean, who had already stripped off his vest, took several steps back, his hands raised. "I'm out. I'm done. I didn't sign up for this." His voice cracked with genuine fear. "Lady, you never told us he was law enforcement." Reginald's voice cut through, calm and steady. "That's because she didn't know." Linda blinked. momentarily disarmed. "What are you talking about?" Reginald straightened, keeping Eddie restrained with one hand. His other hand reached into his back pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. He flipped it open with practiced ease, holding it high enough for everyone, including the dozens of cameras pointed at him, to see the gold badge glinting in the sunlight. "I'm Special Agent Reginald Carter," he announced. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The street went silent. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the breeze and Eddie's ragged breathing as he knelt cuffed on the driveway. The neighbors stared, their shock tangible. Mrs. Henderson across the street clutched her husband's arm and whispered, "I knew he carried himself different." Marcus, the teenager still filming, shouted, "No way! FBI! He's FBI!" The phones caught every second. The badge, the authority in his voice, the look on Linda's face as the truth sank in. Reginald's eyes never left her. "You came onto my property with imposters, Linda. You endangered your own neighbors, thinking intimidation would give you control. But you didn't do your homework. You had no idea who you were dealing with." Her lips quivered, but she tried to recover. This is abuse of power. You can't just—" He cut her off, his voice like steel. "Abuse of power? That's rich, coming from the woman who staged a fake arrest over an HOA dispute. What I'm doing is lawful. What you did is criminal." The neighbors murmured again, this time with an edge of disgust. Every word Linda tried to speak only buried her deeper in shame. Reginald adjusted his grip on Eddie and addressed the crowd. "Let's be clear. This isn't about lawn height or driveways. It's about people pretending to have authority they don't. People who think fear is leadership. That ends today." Eddie groaned, his pride shattered, while Sean stood frozen on the edge of the driveway, looking like he wanted to melt into the ground. Linda finally shouted, desperation boiling over, "You're making a spectacle of this! You're humiliating me!" Reginald's expression softened, though his tone didn't. "No, Linda, you did that yourself. You let pride blind you. You put this entire neighborhood at risk because you couldn't stand the thought of losing control." Phones kept rolling. The evidence was undeniable. Eddie was breathing heavily now, sweat soaking through his shirt, while Sean looked like he might run at any moment. Reginald's badge glinted again in the sunlight, a reminder that the game had shifted completely. "Here's the part you need to understand," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from service. From protecting people, not intimidating them. And when you fake authority, when you cross that line, there's always a reckoning." Linda shook her head violently, her denial collapsing into a desperate plea. "This isn't how it's supposed to go. You weren't supposed to fight back." Reginald met her eyes one final time, and his words landed like a hammer. "That's because you never expected to meet someone who knows what real authority looks like." The neighborhood was silent again, stunned by the revelation. Cameras zoomed tighter. What had started as a petty HOA stunt was now national news material. But the situation wasn't over yet, because real police sirens were already echoing down the block, and the truth was about to become official. The sound of sirens rolled down the block, sharp and undeniable, breaking through the hot Texas air like a warning bell. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, growing brighter with each second. The neighbors stirred, shifting from their porches and sidewalks, their phones tilting to capture the moment that would decide how this standoff ended. Eddie knelt on the driveway, hands cuffed behind him, his bravado completely gone. Sean had retreated to the curb, head in his hands, muttering curses to himself. And Linda, her face pale, her voice shaky, was trying to hold on to whatever control she thought she still had. You can't do this," she stammered. "The police will side with me. They know me. I'm the president of this HOA." Reginald adjusted his stance, keeping Eddie restrained with ease. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Linda, the only thing they'll know is that you called in imposters to intimidate a homeowner, and they'll know because your whole neighborhood watched you do it." He tilted his chin toward the crowd. "Every single phone out here is evidence." Linda glanced around wildly. It was true. Neighbors on all sides had their cameras up. Some whispered into phones, likely live streaming. Others simply recorded, capturing every word, every flicker of panic on her face. The Hendersons, still on their porch, shook their heads in disbelief. "She's finished," Mr. Henderson muttered. His wife nodded. "It's all on tape." Reginald leaned slightly toward Eddie, who was trembling. "Stay still. When the officers arrive, I'll turn you over. Don't make this harder on yourself." Eddie didn't argue. His fight was gone, replaced by the dread of what was waiting for him once the flashing lights reached the driveway. The crowd buzzed louder as the patrol cars finally pulled up. 2 of them, tires crunching against the asphalt as they parked diagonally across the street. Doors opened, and uniformed officers stepped out, hands near their belts, eyes scanning the scene with suspicion. "Hands where we can see them!" one officer barked. Reginald immediately raised his free hand, still holding Eddie securely with the other. His voice was calm and clear. "Officers, I'm Special Agent Reginald Carter, FBI. Badge is in my pocket, identification ready. The man in my custody attempted to impersonate law enforcement and assaulted me on my property." The officers hesitated, their eyes darting from the badge glinting in Reginald's wallet to the neighborhood full of witnesses. One officer, a broad man with dark hair, stepped closer, his hand out. "Let me see your credentials, sir." Reginald nodded, slowly reaching into his pocket and producing his ID. The officer studied it carefully, then looked back at Reginald. Something in his face shifted. Respect, mixed with relief. "All right," the officer said firmly. "You're good. We'll take him from here." The crowd broke into murmurs again, relief mixing with excitement. Phones zoomed in as the officers lifted Eddie to his feet, cuffed behind his back, and walked him toward the squad car. Linda's voice cracked, desperation pouring out. "Wait. No. He's not the criminal here, Reginald is. He's twisting everything. You have to believe me." Another officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, stepped toward Linda. "Ma'am, we've got multiple witnesses, and from what I see, this looks very bad for you. Did you authorize these men to act as law enforcement?" Linda's mouth opened, but no words came. The crowd murmured louder, neighbors calling out, "She brought them here. We saw it. She told them to arrest him." The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, you're going to need to step aside. If you continue to interfere, we'll have to treat this as obstruction." Linda's shoulders slumped, her fight draining. Her authority, once absolute in the eyes of her HOA board, meant nothing under the flashing red and blue lights. Reginald kept his composure, standing tall as Eddie was loaded into the back of a squad car. Sean stood off to the side, hands raised nervously, muttering, "I didn't touch anybody. I swear. I'm done. I just want to go home." One officer approached him. "We'll need your statement. Don't move." The crowd was no longer silent. Neighbors whispered, cheered softly, or simply stared, unable to believe the spectacle that had played out in their quiet community. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide, taking in the lesson that authority could be faked and exposed. Reginald finally spoke, his voice rising just enough for the neighbors to hear. "This is why you don't let fear dictate your choices. Real authority doesn't hide behind fake vests and intimidation. It serves, it protects, and it answers to the truth." The younger officer glanced at him with something close to admiration before turning back to her unit. Linda, however, couldn't let go. She shouted one last desperate plea. "You think you've won, Reginald, but people like you don't belong in neighborhoods like this." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some voices shouted back immediately. "That's enough! We all heard you, Linda. You've lost every ounce of respect." Reginald didn't react with anger. He simply looked at her with quiet disappointment. "You just told everyone exactly who you are, and that'll stay with you longer than anything I could ever say." Phones captured her collapse, her neighbors turning away from her, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath. Linda, the once proud president of the HOA, now stood exposed, isolated, her authority shattered. But as Eddie sat in the back of the squad car and Sean prepared to give his statement, the fallout of Linda's actions was only beginning, and the neighborhood was about to reckon with the damage she had caused. By the time both patrol cars were parked and Eddie was sitting cuffed in the back of one, the neighborhood had transformed into something close to a courtroom. Neighbors clustered at the ends of their driveways, whispering, pointing, filming, their voices a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. The hum of squad radios crackled through the air, blending with the steady wail of a siren still winding down. Officer Ramirez, the broad-shouldered man who had taken Reginald's ID earlier, stood at the center of the scene, speaking in a low voice with his partner, Officer Green. Every so often, their eyes flicked toward Linda, who was pacing like a caged animal, muttering under her breath and shaking her head. Reginald stood calm and upright near his front steps, hands clasped loosely behind his back. He hadn't moved since Eddie had been loaded into the squad car, and he didn't need to. His stillness radiated more authority than Linda's frantic pacing ever could. Finally, Officer Ramirez walked over to him. "Agent Carter, appreciate your cooperation. We've confirmed your credentials with dispatch. From the looks of it, you handled this situation by the book." Reginald gave a slight nod. "My goal was to keep it from escalating further. He came at me with cuffs. I had no choice but to detain him until you arrived." Ramirez sighed. "Well, the good news is we've got everything on tape. Between your neighbor's recording and our body cams, it's a pretty airtight case. Impersonation, unlawful restraint, trespassing, conspiracy. We'll let the DA sort the charges." Reginald glanced at Linda, who froze under his gaze. "Don't forget instigation," he said evenly. Ramirez followed his look. "Yeah, we're not ignoring her role." He raised his voice toward the younger officer, Green. "Bring her over here," the crowd murmured again, buzzing with anticipation. Officer Green approached Linda. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you." Linda lifted her chin, trying to mask her fear with indignation. "This is a misunderstanding. I was only trying to maintain community standards. That's my job. I didn't commit a crime." Green's tone stayed neutral but firm. "Ma'am, your job doesn't involve authorizing private citizens to impersonate law enforcement. We'll need you to come with us and provide a statement downtown." Gasps rippled across the neighborhood. Someone whispered, "They're taking her in." Another muttered, "About time." Linda's composure cracked. "You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president." Reginald's voice cut through her outburst, calm but devastating. "That title doesn't place you above the law. If anything, it means you should have known better." Phones zoomed in, capturing her face as the truth sank in. Green placed a hand gently on her arm, guiding her toward the squad car. She resisted at first, pulling back, but the officer's grip tightened just enough to show she didn't have a choice. The neighbors muttered again, some recording, others whispering as Linda was escorted past them, her authority stripped away in real time. Sean, still lingering at the curb, spoke up nervously. "Am I going to jail too?" Ramirez turned to him. "We'll need a full statement from you. Depending on your role, that'll determine whether charges stick. Best thing you can do is cooperate." Sean nodded quickly, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'll talk. I'll tell you everything. I didn't want this to go this far." Ramirez gave him a curt nod before signaling another officer to escort him aside. Reginald exhaled slowly, finally letting some of the tension leave his shoulders. The neighbors' voices swirled around him, a mix of admiration, relief, and quiet awe. A few clapped softly. One man called out, "You handled that better than anyone else could have." He didn't respond to the applause. He simply looked at the officers and asked, "What happens next?" Ramirez answered, "We'll book Eddie and Linda, get their statements, and file charges. Sean's involvement will depend on what he admits. After that, it's up to the courts. You'll likely be asked to testify." Reginald gave another nod. "That's fine." His eyes swept across the neighborhood, meeting the stares of his neighbors. "The important thing is that this street is safe again." Officer Green stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You know, Agent Carter, we don't usually walk into scenes like this where the suspect's already cuffed and detained. You made our job a lot easier today." Reginald's tone stayed professional. "I didn't want blood on anyone's hands. That's always the goal. Control without chaos." But the irony wasn't lost on him. The neighborhood was far from calm. For years, Linda had ruled with an iron fist disguised as community leadership, and tonight, that illusion had shattered in front of every single resident. The Hendersons whispered to each other, their eyes on Reginald. "He's not just a neighbor anymore," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "He's the one who protected us from her." Her husband nodded. People are going to remember this. As the squad cars prepared to pull away, one carrying Eddie and the other Linda, the crowd lingered, unable to look away. The flashing lights painted the brick homes in red and blue, a reminder that their neighborhood had changed forever in a single afternoon. Reginald stood tall, silent, his gaze fixed on the departing cars. He hadn't asked for any of this, but he knew the fallout was only beginning. But what no one on that street realized yet was that the aftermath, the fallout in the days that followed, would change their community far more than this one confrontation ever could. The following days in Plano felt like the neighborhood was living under a magnifying glass. The flashing lights may have left, but the tension hadn't. What had played out in Reginald's driveway didn't just end with 2 people in the back of squad cars, it spread through the block like wildfire. By Sunday morning, everyone had seen the videos. Clips were circulating on Facebook groups, shared on Nextdoor, even making their way to local news stations. The headline scrolled across one Dallas news channel. HOA president detained after confrontation with FBI agent neighbor. For neighbors who had quietly resented Linda's heavy-handed approach, it felt like vindication. Mrs. Henderson waved at Reginald from her porch the next morning, her voice carrying across the street. "You did this community a service. Don't you forget it." Others weren't as vocal, but their glances spoke volumes. Some looked at Reginald with newfound respect, others with unease, because no one had expected that the man who waved politely while mowing his lawn was an FBI agent capable of handling danger with surgical precision. Linda's absence was glaring. Her house sat dark, the blinds drawn, her car gone. The HOA board sent out a carefully worded email by Tuesday. The association will be conducting a special meeting to address recent events and determine next steps in leadership. Neighbors read between the lines. Linda was finished. But the fallout wasn't just about Linda. Eddie's mugshot had been plastered across local news sites. His background revealed a trail of minor criminal charges, petty theft, disorderly conduct, unpaid fines. Nothing suggested authority, but everything suggested desperation. Sean, meanwhile, was cooperating fully, giving statements to police about how Linda had recruited them with promises of community enforcement pay. He admitted she had stoked their egos, told them the neighborhood needed strong men to keep people like Reginald in line. The revelation disgusted most neighbors. In hushed conversations over hedges and driveways, the truth spilled out. Linda had been complaining about Reginald for months, using coded language, hinting that he wasn't a good fit for the neighborhood. By Wednesday, a group of residents gathered in the community park for an informal meeting. Reginald hadn't planned to attend, but when he walked by on his evening jog, the group waved him over. "Agent Carter," one man called out, his tone respectful. "We just want to thank you. What you did, it showed us all what was really going on." Reginald slowed, catching his breath, shaking his head. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I live here too. My family lives here. And I wasn't about to let intimidation rule this street." A woman holding her daughter's hand spoke up. "But it's bigger than that. You showed us that fear only works if we let it." Linda's been making people feel small for years, and no one pushed back. Until you. Reginald's gaze softened. He crouched slightly so he was eye level with the little girl. "That's the lesson you need to remember. Bullies get power when good people stay quiet. But when you stand your ground, when you speak truth, fear loses its grip." The girl smiled shyly, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Word of Reginald's role didn't stay local for long. By Friday, a national morning show picked up the story. The clip of him calmly showing his badge while holding Eddie restrained played on a loop, the anchor describing it as a moment where truth cut through false authority. But Reginald never leaned into the fame. When a reporter stopped by his house for a comment, he politely declined. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about accountability. That's the story." Behind the cameras, however, he couldn't help but reflect on what it meant. For years, his work at the Bureau had been about dismantling networks far larger and more dangerous than one overzealous HOA president. Yet here, on his own street, he'd faced something just as corrosive: misused power dressed up as leadership. At the next HOA meeting, the board voted unanimously to remove Linda from her position. Her chair sat empty, symbolic of how far she had fallen. A new president was chosen, someone quieter, humbler, someone who promised transparency and collaboration. Still, the wound lingered. The neighborhood wasn't going to forget the day its leader had tried to weaponize fake authority against one of their own. Parents talked about it with their kids. Teachers at the local elementary school even used it as an example in class discussions about honesty and responsibility. For Reginald, the fallout was less about Linda's downfall and more about the conversations it sparked. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another were suddenly talking about what community meant, what leadership should look like, and why accountability mattered. One evening, as he stood watering his front lawn, Marcus, the teenager who had live-streamed the whole incident, approached him. "Mr. Carter," he said almost shyly, "that video's at 1 million views now. People keep saying you're a hero." Reginald smiled faintly. "I'm not a hero, Marcus. I'm just a man who refused to be bullied." Marcus tilted his head, thoughtful. "Yeah, but you showed us all how to do it." Reginald looked down the street, where kids were riding bikes again and neighbors were chatting on porches. The block wasn't perfect, but it felt lighter now, freer somehow. "Maybe that's the real win," he said quietly. But even as peace returned to the street, Reginald knew there was still one more lesson to share, the kind of truth that could outlast any HOA rule or neighborhood feud. Saturday morning came again, 1 week after the confrontation that shook the neighborhood. The air was calmer, the lawns freshly cut, kids racing their bikes without parents peering nervously through blinds. Yet the echoes of that day still lingered. Every time someone passed Reginald's driveway, they glanced at it like it was a landmark, the place where truth stood taller than intimidation. Reginald himself kept his routine simple. He walked out with his morning coffee, leaned against the railing of his porch, and watched the block stir awake. He hadn't sought out attention, but the neighborhood gave it to him anyway. A neighbor waved as she loaded groceries into her car. A man mowing his lawn raised a hand in thanks. Even people who had never spoken to him before now offered nods of acknowledgement. But Reginald didn't bask in it. He wasn't wired that way. What sat on his mind wasn't pride, it was the lesson he wanted his community to carry forward. That afternoon, the HOA board called a special neighborhood gathering in the community park. Word spread quickly, and nearly every household sent someone. Families sat on folding chairs, children ran in the grass, and a sense of anticipation filled the air. When Reginald arrived, conversations hushed. He wasn't there as an official speaker, just as a neighbor. But the board chair, a quiet man named Harold Jennings, who had just been voted interim president, asked him to address the group. Reginald hesitated at first, then stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice much, but the crowd leaned in, hanging on his words. "Last week," he began, "we all saw what happens when authority is faked, when power is used to intimidate instead of protect. And the truth is, it could have gone very differently. Someone could have been hurt. Kids were watching. Phones were recording. Lives could have been ruined far worse than they already were." He paused, scanning the faces, some solemn, some curious, some ashamed. "What I want you to take away from that moment isn't about me. It isn't about the FBI. It's about the kind of neighborhood we want to live in. Do we want fear to govern our streets? Or do we want respect and accountability?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Reginald continued, "Leadership isn't about control. It's about service. And service means putting people first, even when it's inconvenient, even when you don't get credit. That's the difference between authority and arrogance." A hand shot up from the back. It was Mrs. Henderson, her voice strong despite her age. "Agent Carter, what should we do the next time someone tries something like this?" Reginald didn't hesitate. "Stand together. Speak up. Don't let fear isolate you. The reason those imposters had any chance at all was because they thought the neighborhood would stay silent. Silence is what bullies feed on. But when you speak truth, when you shine light on lies, the game ends." The crowd clapped softly, then louder as the message settled in. Parents nodded, whispering to their kids. The teenagers, including Marcus, filmed from the back, capturing every word for a new live stream. Reginald looked down at Marcus. You keep posting those videos, young man, but make sure they're not just about drama. Use your platform to spread truth, to show people what accountability looks like. Marcus grinned. Yes, sir. That's the plan. As the gathering ended, people lingered, talking with one another more than they had in years. Strangers introduced themselves, shaking hands, asking about families. The tension that once defined their street seemed to dissolve into something else. Connection. Later that evening, Reginald returned home. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the quiet block. He stood for a moment at the end of his driveway, the same spot where everything had gone down just days earlier. The memory of Eddie's cuffs, Linda's shouts, and the flashing red and blue lights was still vivid. But now, that space symbolized something else. A turning point. He thought back to his years in the bureau, the endless briefings about criminal networks, the dangerous missions, the times he had stared into the eyes of men who lived on fear and power. And it struck him that sometimes the battles that mattered most weren't fought in foreign cities or dark alleys. They were fought right at home, on the streets where children played and families built their lives. He whispered quietly to himself, almost as a prayer, the truth always comes to light. The sound of children laughing down the block pulled him back. He smiled faintly, picked up the empty trash can by the curb, and walked it back to his garage, because life was moving forward. And that was